Hello and welcome to part 3 of the female system. Now, when we look at the females, the anatomy is a little simpler, but the hormones are more tricky. So here is the sagittal section. Here is the bladder with the urethra for urination. And then at the back, you've got your digestive tract with your rectum and your anus. And in the middle is your uterus and your vagina. Now, quite often people refer to the vagina as the whole thing, but really the vagina is just the tract, the channel at the top. The external part that a lot of people refer to as the vagina is actually the vulva, and we'll look at that in when we get to that part. Now, here is a video link where the sound is weird. But we will look at the sound. The sound is weird, so I've shut it off. And it is a very, it's kind of an archaic one. Let's look at, here you've got, so this is the dorsal side. Here's your rectum, which is quite large. Here is your uterus sort of stuck in between the bladder and the rectum. So it is actually quite small until you put a baby in it. And then it grows quite large and does jump directly on the uterus, on the bladder. I don't have the sound on because it was giving me some weird double sound thing. So I'm, if you're having difficulty, either just look at it on your own. And I really just wanted to show you the model because it rotates, and also it will give you a good comparison to the sizes.
Reproductive tract.
So there's the female reproductive tract, and then when it spins around,
pelvic digestive system behind
you will see the size.
So the main parts that I'm going to talk about are the ovaries.
Many parts we talk about. We've got the ovaries here. Then there are these tubes, which are called the fallopian tubes, the uterine tubes, and sometimes they are called the
which is this muscular sac,
oviducts,
which is
just
where
to give
the
more detail. And then you have the bladder underneath. So the fetus develops here. Here is the vagina, which opens up to the perineum. And then when you rotate, you can see how they're all layered underneath each other. This video goes into a little more detail than we want to know, but I liked the way it showed the relative space on it. So I'm going to shut that off now, and hopefully I'll get my sound back. Okay, so let's look at a little more detail. You've got the ovaries, which are your primary organs. This is where the eggs develop. The egg is sometimes called a follicle because there is more than just the egg cell itself. It's a large collection of cells that travel along. Then you have the fallopian tube, also called the oviduct, also called the uterine tube. This textbook calls fallopian tube, so it'll be testable as fallopian tube. Don't worry too much about the ligaments other than to realize there's a lot of ligaments that hold it to the wall. Then you've got the uterus and the cervix, which is at the bottom. It's bottom that holds it in, that holds the baby in, and it's sort of the opening. Usually the cervix is quite tight except during ovulation. Then the vagina, as I said, is just the canal, and then the outside is a little different. So these are the terms I want you to look at. Let's look at another diagram to look at the bottom terms. Oh, first off, the fallopian tube, there's a term that we're going to look at called the fimbriae, and the fimbriae are these fringes on the oviduct. And unlike the sperm, which stays in a continuous tube, there is actually an opening at the end of the fallopian tube that allows things to go in and out. And this is how endometriosis, which is a condition where the lining of the uterus comes out, and ectopic pregnancies. And we'll talk more about it when I show you a video during, with the moving of the fimbriae. So we've got the internal, or the main parts, the uterus, the cervix at the bottom. Now let's look at some other terms. The labia, which are basically the lips, the clitoris, the vulva, and the vestibular glands. So the vulva is the whole external area. And the vulva goes right from the top, right, is well, underneath the lips, basically. You've got two lips or two folds. So labium means lips. You have the labial majus, which is the larger one, the thicker one. And then you have the minimus, which is the thinner one on the inside. You have the clitoris at the front. And the clitoris is the sensitive button, as it's called in female novels. This is where it's sensory, and it will be the source of sexual stimulation. Then you've got the urethral opening, the opening to the vaginal opening, and the anus. Then there are glands that we don't normally hear about, and that is they're mucus glands to help lubrication during sex, and they're on the outside. They're not on the inside, but they go outside, and then with sexual activity, the fluid is brought inside. And usually you don't pay much attention to these glands unless there is a disease in the glands. So you've got the vestibular glands, the lesser ones, which are open up here, and then you've got the greater ones, which open down at the bottom. And they're on the outside. These secretions keep the vulva moist and provide lubrication during intercourse. Good. So those are the parts of the female. Good. And if we look at now the complicated stuff, the development. So in the ovary, there's a lot of different stages, and it doesn't really move around like an escalator in this part, but it starts as the egg develops as a follicle. So you have the follicle and then the cells around it. Then as it develops a space, and during ovulation, just the egg comes out and all these extra cells stay behind. And these extra cells that stay behind become something called a corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum will then disintegrate. Don't worry about the term corpus albicans, but realize that the corpus luteum, as we'll learn later, produces progesterone. So that's why it's important. And as it disintegrates and if it's not stimulated by more hormones, it will decrease the progesterone level. Okay, so there's all these terms. Don't worry too much about the primary and secondary. Just realize that you've got the egg or the oocyte in the mature follicle. Okay, so we are going to look at the menstrual cycle or the ovarian cycle on a video. Hopefully this works okay. If not, just stop this and play the video on its
in the female reproductive cycle.
So when we look at the female reproductive
the ovaries,
system,
and the
it
uterus,
starts with
their activities are closely
coordinated. So you've
coordinated.
got pituitary,
Each
ovary,
month, one or other ovary releases a
and
single egg.
during the
an
menstrual
event
cycle,
known as
here is the little follicle, the little egg, which is coming out of the great big ovary. Notice it's just a little ball of cells.
ovulation. It is brought about by a
Here is the fimbriae that we're talking about.
series of complex interactions between the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and the uterus.
So when we look at the female, we have the hypothalamus, which talks to the pituitary, and there's two hormones that come out of the pituitary, if you remember, luteinizing and follicle stimulating, and then that will act on the ovary.
The pituitary gland is itself under the control of this small area of the brain known as the hypothalamus. A new menstrual cycle begins when the nerve cells of this center secrete a hormone called gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, GnRH, into the network of blood vessels which surrounds the pituitary gland. Stimulated by pulses of gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, cells in the pituitary gland secrete another hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone.
Okay, gonadotrophin, first off, hypothalamus release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which travels in the blood and acts on the anterior pituitary.
Hormone, or FSH. FSH travels in the bloodstream, reaching the ovaries. There it stimulates the formation and growth of an ovarian follicle in one or other ovary. The follicle consists of an egg, a number of surrounding cells which secrete estrogen hormones, and fluid. FSH helps the egg to mature and prepares it for release. As the follicle matures, the hypothalamus increases secretion of GnRH. This in turn stimulates the pituitary to secrete.
Okay. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle to develop
a second hormone which acts on the ovary. This is luteinizing hormone, or LH.
The second hormone is luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone has one main purpose, and that is to cause ovulation.
Toward the middle of the cycle, there is a sudden peak in the blood.
Now, ovulation is textbook on the 14th day. So when you look at the menstrual cycle for a woman, it is on every textbook, it's 28 days, but not in most humans or most females, unless you're regulated with birth control. So 0 day or day 1 is the first day of menstruation. So that's something to note. And then day 14 is ovulation.
Level of LH. This acts as the trigger for ovulation.
And it's the surge of luteinizing hormone that causes ovulation.
Within minutes of its release, the egg is guided by suction through the fringed opening of the outer.
Now there you can see how there is this gap on the outside, and the oviduct, the fimbriae of the oviduct, move around, detected by chemicals, to sweep over the egg and draw the egg into the oviduct.
End of the fallopian tube, starting it on a journey which will take 5 or 6 days as it passes down.
Now, when it moves up the oviduct, there's 2 processes moving it. There is the cilia, which helps sweep it in, and there is also contractions, uterine contractions, or sorry, oviduct contractions, smooth muscle contractions.
Down the tube and finally reaches the cavity of the uterus. Meanwhile,
now in the ideal world, it is in the oviduct that fertilization happens, if it is going to happen. Okay, because the egg left, there is now this set of tissues left behind. This is the corpus luteum.
After the follicle ruptures, it is converted into this yellowish body known as the corpus luteum. Cells of the corpus luteum secrete
the corpus luteum excretes progesterone, or secretes progesterone. Progesterone will then go and act on the uterus. See how it's confusing? It's confusing because there's
hormone progesterone, which brings about important changes in the lining of the uterus, preparing it for possible pregnancy. In fact, the lining of the
So progesterone will act on the uterine lining to thicken it up.
Uterus, known as the endometrium, undergoes changes in response to hormone levels during the cycle. In the first half of the cycle, known as the...
Now, there's a lot of different phases outlined in this video. Don't worry about the phases. Pay attention to what is estrogen and progesterone doing.
The follicular phase, the developing follicle secretes in...
And notice this is the British spelling of estrogen. So, estrogen is secreted from the growing follicle. The estrogen will start the lining of the uterus. It's progesterone that helps maintain it.
Increasing amounts of estrogen hormone, which encourages regeneration of the endometrium. After ovulation, there are important changes in the endometrium, aimed at making it suitable to receive a fertilized egg. These changes are brought about by a secretion of progesterone from the corpus luteum. The secretion of progesterone is maintained for several days, but if the egg is not fertilized in...
Okay, at the end of the cycle, the follicle is gone, so it's no longer secreting estrogen. The corpus luteum has degraded, so it's no longer secreting progesterone. It is the drop in hormones here that will cause the levels to fall. And when the levels fall, this is what causes menstruation. There's no longer the hormonal component to maintain the uterine lining. So the uterine lining is shed, and that is technically day 28, which is day 1.
In that time, the corpus luteum withers, and falling levels of progesterone and estrogen trigger the shedding of the uterine lining as the menstrual flow. The cycle then starts again.
Okay, it's kind of tricky, but we will look at it. So when we look at the hormones, in order to understand, the hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which will then act on the anterior pituitary to release 2 hormones, let's start with follicle stimulating hormone. And follicle stimulating hormone starts the follicle to grow. We're not sure why we're capitalizing. Okay, and then the second hormone is luteinizing hormone, and luteinizing hormone surges at day 14 and causes ovulation. Okay. And then the follicle, as it grows, will release estrogen, which starts the uterus development, and not uterine lining development, which, if you remember, is the endometrium. And the corpus luteum will produce progesterone, which will continue, maintain and thickening is the word we want. Can't spell, sorry. Maintain and thicken the lining. When the lining drops, the maintain, there we go. I'm used to you guys correcting it before I get to it. Okay, so the action is act on ant pituitary. Okay, good. Now, when we look at this, this is all graphed out. It is kind of confusing, but to summarize, follicle stimulating hormone is slowly released, but it will cause the follicle to develop. As the follicle develops, it starts the release of estrogen, which is the blue line. Then, the stimulation of the anterior pituitary produces luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone spikes right before day 14, which is ovulation. And that will then cause the egg to be released, leaving the corpus luteum. As the corpus luteum develops, you get your progesterone. As your progesterone develops, it increases the uterine lining. As the corpus luteum starts to regress and degrade, the progesterone levels drop. When the levels of progesterone and estrogen are low, menstruation occurs. Okay, so that is the process that it goes through. Okay, before we continue on, let's look at a few questions on page 485, just to summarize, because that was brutal. So what is the surge of the hormone that causes ovulation? Luteinizing hormone, where does it come from? Anterior pituitary. The embryo attaches to which lining of the uterine wall? We didn't talk about this, but hopefully you know by your terms what the lining is. Endo means inside, so it's endometrium. Falling levels of what 2 hormones trigger menstruation? Notice we say it's menstruation, but there's actually an R in there, so it should technically be pronounced menstruation. 2 levels that drop, estrogen and progesterone. The structure that secretes progesterone, corpus luteum. Good. that is enough for this video. So we will, I'll end this one because you need a bit of a break before we hit you with the last part of female hormones.